Discernment isn't cynicism, nor does it mean that you are untrusting. It means that you recognize that after years or a lifetime of narcissistic abuse, that you need to take a minute, that trauma bonds do linger, and the familiarity of toxic patterns can make them alluring without you even recognizing it. So there's really no other way for me to say it. And I am afraid that since I'm not some dude gamer type YouTube channel, if I keep dropping F-bombs, YouTube's not going to like it. So I'm just going to say effing, and it's probably not professional for me to actually say the word, okay? What am I talking about? So I was talking to a long-term survivor of multiple narcissistic relationships. These relationships span from childhood into adulthood, narcissistic grandparents, parents, and then a long-term marriage with a malignant narcissistic person. The person who I was talking to, extremely nice, easy to get along with, pleasant person, and very resilient. She has been having to solve problems that probably she shouldn't have had to solve since a very young age. She was kicked out of the nest the minute she graduated high school, that kind of thing. Very smart, lovely, lovely person. She's also really, really adaptable. And it led me to think, and then I started thinking about another person I knew in a similar situation I was also talking to a few weeks ago. Narcissistic mother, narcissistic long-term marriage, narcissistic adult child. Again, extraordinarily nice, very pleasant, and as empathic and compassionate as they come. And ridiculously adaptable and resilient. Honestly, probably the most flexible human being I have ever known. Then as I thought about those two people, I rushed to my computer like a crazed detective. I pulled up my clinical files. It's almost like I already knew the answer, but I wanted to see how the data would show up. And in the vast majority of clients I've worked with who are survivors, long-term survivors of narcissistic abuse with childhood narcissistic exposure, then adult narcissistic exposure, not all, but most, okay, not all, but definitely most, I'd say 85, 90% plus, were nice, pleasant, empathic, and above all else, were extremely adaptable, resilient, and flexible. In that most recent conversation I had with the survivor of multiple narcissistic relationships, I was reflecting on how difficult her life had been since her divorce from a malignant narcissistic person. It was horrific, terrible post-separation abuse, and she got financially pretty wrecked by him, no big surprise, but she just kept trying to make her life work. When she encounters difficult people in the months and years since then, she makes it work. When things require a workaround, she makes it work. It's not always easy, but she makes it work, and she always has. She had no choice. Almost none of the people she had encountered, significant people, since she was a child, none of them would have helped her. And as a kid, she didn't know what narcissism was, and she didn't even know what narcissism was for most of her marriage. So she kept trying to change herself, adapt herself, to be better for the marriage, to be better, to do more, just like most people who go through narcissistic abuse. And then she learned about narcissism, and in her case, she got out. Listen, some people stick out the relationships. I mean, in her case, she got out. But it dawned on me that she is so resilient, like really, really resilient. Most of these folks who go through this are, but as I talked to her, I said, this is really effed up resilience. Because to this day, she and most of these folks who survived these relationships were still having to create workarounds, often for a lifetime. Because the people, the close people to them who were supposed to be supports, who were supposed to help, to guide, to be present, such as parents should have been, never were. So they had to figure it all out. Everything from applying to school, to doing homework, to tending their broken hearts, to dealing with play yard bullies, to even having to take care of the parent or the parent's needs when they were children. And then as adults, finding themselves often having to appease a fragile narcissistic spouse or partner or family member, sacrificing things that matter to them, doing more and more and striving to be enough for the narcissistic person. So maybe the marriage or relationship could work out. It meant that they were as adaptable, flexible, and resilient as anyone I had ever met. But it was really effed up resilience. A need to have to learn to do every single thing in their lives alone,
because help was almost never coming. To be able to turn on a dime at the last minute and be flexible, because the narcissistic people in their lives often pulled the rug out from underneath them. To learn emotional regulation skills that were literally out of this world, because every day was a disappointment. They learned to never have the good things that happened to them ever celebrated, because the narcissistic people around them would typically ignore, mock, dismiss, or devalue anything good that happened to them. But yet they still kept on keeping on, I guess, and striving and doing their best. These folks also learned that the people who were close to them, partners, parents, family members, would not soothe them at times of pain. So they did their best to cultivate other supports, perhaps seek out therapy. They figured it all out. Listen, I'm a shrink. I'm the first one that's going to tell you resilience is great. It's associated with a whole bunch of great outcomes, better health and mental health outcomes. It's associated with success, with better overall functioning. Resilience is about flexibility. It is efficacy. It's problem-solving abilities. It's a stress management tool. It's a stress management approach. It is about not getting stuck in just one way of doing things, but being able to pivot to taking a new route, taking on a new routine, quickly packing up and starting again. Resilient people rally. They often uplift and encourage other people. Resilient folks are the people you want at your side when you walk through the gates of hell. Not everyone who goes through adversity develops resilience. Some folks don't have it. Some folks don't cultivate it. And those folks will struggle for a lifetime after they experience adversity. I'll tell you one little hack. If you're ever hiring for a job, hire the resilient person. Resilient people tend to be agreeable and have persistence and grit. As a side note, listen, not all survivors of narcissistic abuse are resilient. Many, if not most, are, but a subset may actually find that the mental health struggles that are a product of the chronic emotional abuse overwhelm them and undercut resilience. Whether or not someone develops resilience often relates to a lot of things, like how severe, consistent, and inescapable the narcissistic abuse is, whether other traumas were happening, or whether this elevated to the level of relational trauma, other mental health issues that may be co-occurring, and the presence of how much support a person has. Do they have resources? Do they have supports? Some of that can have to do with their resilience, and a lot of it probably comes down to temperament. But the resilience a human being has to develop as a result of chronic narcissistic abuse is effed up. You basically have to learn to chronically appease another person, always have a plan B, C, D, E, and F, live in a constant state of disappointment. It's resilience with a huge side helping of grief. When I work with survivors, I have to remind them how resilient they are. But when they reflect, they don't even think of themselves as resilient. But when they reflect on why they are so resilient, it can bring up some really painful feelings, which is understandable. Effed up resilience can sometimes feel less like resilience and more like endurance. The way a resilient person can figure it out, a resilient person can figure it out if they don't get food for 8 hours while they're traveling, right? It's similar. Effed up resilience means you are able to just stand up in the face of toxic people and keep on keeping on. I know a gal who had a narcissistic dad, kind of a narcissistic mom, a narcissistic partner, and is surrounded by narcissistic friends. She is resilient and kind and flexible. And her endurance for the toxic BS of the people around her is prodigious. It's actually kind of painful to watch. Survivors should not have had to become so resilient, right? They may have been equally resilient even if they didn't have lots of narcissistic in their relationships. But resilience, in a way, at some level, while it can be cultivated, a lot of it is a trait. Effed up resilience is a combination of resilience and trauma response and a survival skill set that'll occur, again, alongside that trait of resilience. It can feel different than regular garden variety resilience. Listen, children are not in a position to make sense of narcissistic behavior, and most people are not taught this. So even as that child comes up into adulthood, They may not recognize that their flexibility and amenability and adaptability are part and parcel of the resilience that came out of the workarounds and the tolerance of disappointment that narcissistic abuse requires. However, in a strange way, the resilience, this thing that is so good for us, becomes a risk factor, because the resilience means that when we keep encountering narcissistic people in adulthood, well, we are flexible, right? We may be more likely to make excuses or give second chances or forgive. We may almost reflexively just do the workaround, drive 100 miles out of our way, do what needs to be done because we're resilient. We may not think twice about the flexibility and the adaptations we're making for toxic people. So the very thing, the resilience that is protective and good for us, may actually make things more difficult in narcissistic relationships, unless we understand narcissism. Because that effed up resilience can end up being one of the gifts that you take out of the narcissistic relationship. It can become a flexibility that allows you to pursue goals and dreams in a gritty and persistent way. It can allow you to be a great friend to healthy people who are hopefully also flexible and agreeable. Once the narcissistic folks in your life are largely disengaged from, it can contribute to your health and well-being to have this prodigious level of resilience. It can also help you manage stress. So if you could take that resilience, know who the toxic folks are, be flexible in your life, but give yourself permission to disengage from those toxic folks. Resilience isn't about enduring other people's toxicity just because you're able to. It's about being discerning and giving yourself permission to disengage and being flexible in a way that isn't about appeasing and giving in to them, but about being more stress resistant. So this effed up resilience, right, which so many people who've gone through narcissistic abuse have, this ability to just really roll with those punches and keep getting up and rolling and getting knocked down and keep getting up. It's something that I've really, really seen quite frequently in a large proportion of survivors of narcissistic abuse. And what I do see, especially with the people who get out of a narcissistic relationship, an option I know is not available to not to everyone, but when they get out, the resilience stays around, but they're not working around the narcissistic person in the same way anymore. And there's an adaptability. It's unlike anything I've ever seen in other people. And really, like I said, these are the people you want to travel with and do things with because there's a real ease to them. We're like, okay, sure, we can do it that way, or I could do it that way, or I'm easy. And they really can make it work. The counterweight to this is that effed up resilience can mean that it can sometimes be difficult to make your needs and wants known because you're so used to going with the flow. And part of the process of healing is giving yourself permission to sometimes say, yeah, no, I don't want to go to that restaurant. I don't eat that kind of food. Like to find some of that voice, because the effed up resilience can often mean that you're so flexible that you don't make those needs and wants known. So it's definitely an evolution. But when we think about this effed up resilience that so many survivors have, there's in the midst of that is a real gift you can pull out and make your own, because it's a wonderful, wonderful quality to have, especially as you get older. But let's just get the effed up part out of it so you don't spend your life appeasing or don't run the risk of letting more narcissistic people into your life.
A really difficult thing to sort of reckon for ourselves is this, or reconcile for ourselves, is this idea that survivors need to be more discerning than other people. One thing that narcissistic abuse takes from people is the sense that we have the right to get to set boundaries or do what is good for us. Years of being gaslighted and minimized and dismissed, and perhaps even a lifetime of being told that we didn't have the right to do very basic human things like set boundaries, becomes our reality. We kind of have the sense of, who the hell do I think I am to do that? That I can actually be so selective about who enters my life. People who have been through narcissistic abuse may literally feel that it is hubris to think that they have the right to say no to someone or choose to do what feels more comfortable or safe, or to even disengage from a toxic relationship. And all of this becomes really important when we are thinking about something called discernment. And we've talked about that on this channel before. Now, not all people and situations are created the same. And learning to trust ourselves enough to tell the difference between situations is an important part of healing. Discernment means knowing that there are some people out there that we are actually safe, relatively safe sharing ourselves with, others that require some pretty tight boundaries, and yet others where we really need to turn on our heel and get the hell out of there before we talk to them. That means then to engage in discernment means that we need to slow way down when we meet someone and take the time to get to know someone before letting them in, so that we can do things like recognize the gaslighting in real time and take that as a sign to not engage with someone, for example. That we can recognize someone who has kind of uncomfortable boundaries and give ourselves permission to step back from that person. Listen, there are some people out there who are so fortunate that they have not been through significant narcissistic abuse. Those folks are lucky. They can afford to not be that discerning. They can actually take some real chances in relationships and maybe even have more porous boundaries with people who may not be the healthiest or safest people. But if you don't have that history of narcissistic abuse, you're not taking the kind of risk that survivors of narcissistic abuse do. Survivorship carries with it the risk of getting really quite easily triggered and really thrown off by situations that are reminiscent of the other major and hurtful narcissistic relationships a person has. Or perhaps we let down our guard and we get played again. Survivors often struggle with keeping their boundaries either too loose or overdoing it and putting up a fortress around them instead of setting healthy, normalized boundaries. Learning to calibrate and be discerning is a really big part of the surviving and thriving and, frankly, the growth process. Discernment means several things. It means taking your time in a new relationship, trusting your instincts, or at the very minimum, that physical sense of discomfort you may feel in someone's presence. It means being very careful about how you share and what you share with another person. It means being willing to ignore the enablers when they tell you that you are being overly cautious. It means paying attention to not only what the other person is saying, but also to what they are doing. Discernment also means having enough self-regard, self-compassion, and self-respect to take your time with a given situation. It means that we value ourselves enough to believe that we are worth taking our time with a situation. Narcissistic abuse can wear away at that sense of self-respect we should have and the right that we are allowed to take our time. There is also that fear that maybe we have unrealistic hopes of meeting healthy people, and that if we don't just fall in line with whoever comes along, that we will end up alone, like we have to rush and figure it out. But after surviving a narcissistic relationship, you've got to know that being alone is far better than being gaslighted. Because discernment is so essential to narcissistic abuse survivorship, it can feel like it takes survivors a longer time to warm up than it does for other people. It can feel like we're sort of running at half speed in terms of how quickly we engage with new people. But that's the legacy of narcissistic abuse. Some of the fallout of narcissistic abuse is that compelling desire that we have to be seen, heard, wanted, desired, cherished, or valued. The fact is, all of those are healthy wants and needs. But the challenge is that survivors are so undernourished in these spaces that there is a risk of going in way too fast with a new person who is offering all of this and then missing the red flags with that new person. Survivors do have to be more discerning to ensure that we aren't being played, gaslighted, and drawn in and sort of deceived by the love bombing, or just filling in those needs that we so desperately want filled with another person. And that way we may miss the other problematic patterns. Narcissistic abuse really does take a toll on our ability to perceive any of this. And breaking our leg twice in the same spot, as I've said before, isn't good for us. Just as being narcissistically abused again and again by different people really takes a toll on us. The fact is, people who've been through narcissistic abuse don't get to take the same kind of relationship chances. Survivors have to be careful, and that means being more discerning than other people. Listen, I know that the people don't like to hear this message. They feel that by being through narcissistic abuse, they've sort of lost out on the ability to sort of throw caution to the wind, the kind of spontaneity that makes life light and fun. They want to take a chance on a stranger or not have to work so hard to have to constantly be teasing out and figuring out the red flags and protecting themselves. But it's risky. And these cycles repeat if we don't stay on top of discernment. The other tricky issue is that this stuff can generalize. It may not be that you're just jumping right in with a new romantic partner, but that you may in fact be making bad calls in a workplace relationship or with a new friend. It doesn't feel good to have to always keep your guard up, but the alternative of getting pulled into narcissistic abuse again may be even more difficult. Discernment isn't cynicism, nor does it mean that you are untrusting. It means that you recognize that after years or a lifetime of narcissistic abuse, that you need to take a minute, that trauma bonds do linger, and the familiarity of toxic patterns can make them alluring without you even recognizing it. That a person who is charming and charismatic and allegedly so good at seeing you can actually be a risk. It doesn't mean that you are missing out by being discerning, but rather that you're taking a minute and cultivating healthier bonds. Listen, a tree doesn't grow overnight. You have to give it a second, right? It means that you allow yourself to set a boundary. And if that means that someone leaves, then that is a way to weed out someone who may not have been good for you. So many survivors are socialized and raised to think that they're so lucky that someone is paying attention to them, that they feel like, oh, I just need to hold on to this or it's going to slip away. That actually is the lifelong legacy of devaluation speaking to you. Discernment doesn't come naturally to survivors. There is that sense of not good enoughness that can leave survivors feeling that if we actually held on to these standards of discernment, that no one is going to stick around, that we don't deserve to be that careful. And that's just simply not true. The key is to see discernment as evolving into an identity of yourself as being someone who holds out for the best for themselves. You can look at it as after a lifetime of bargain shopping, now you're holding out for luxury. But now the luxury is really respect, kindness, reciprocity, and compassion. And by the way, these things really are not luxuries. They're sort of basic to what's a good relationship. But rather to see discernment as a skill and a value, to recognize that your company, that your presence are valuable. And the gift is that someone actually gets to know you, It's not the other way around, that it's such a gift to get to know them necessarily. Maybe it's both ways, but it's a real paradigm shift for survivors. And it can be invaluable in keeping you safer and helping you have more rewarding long-term relationships. As a long-term survivor myself, I've recently had the opportunity to meet some new people. And in some of the situations, things were being said that reminded me of past toxic relationships. And it's really interesting because I'm having a visceral reaction like, is the same terrible thing going to happen? And in real time, again, that almost is like that slow, like you're talking slow way, I sort of slow down and say, this person's talking to me. I've been in a place like this before. I'm going to pay very close attention. Last time I was lapping it up like, oh, you're going to pay attention to me? And this time I'm being really slow. Some people are asking me to commit to things I'm not ready for. I say, give me a minute. Once upon a time, I would have been worried by saying, give me a minute, these people would run away. Having really been through it in my life, I think if my choice is to go through that again or they run away, they can run away. So if you can hold on to the cumulative wisdom of what you've been through in narcissistic abuse, and like I said, I'm going through it in real time right now, and it's really, really interesting. I had already thought about this video, and I'm like, wow, this is fascinating. The discernment sometimes feels like an out-of-body experience. You're sort of watching yourself from the outside and saying, this feels familiar. Doesn't mean that these things are going to happen with this new person or new people. But some of this reminds me of things that have happened to me before. It doesn't mean I'm completely ruling it out, but I'm telling a lot of these people, I'm busy, I need a minute. And if that's enough for them to walk away, then it wasn't meant to be.
Now, I know we've taken on this topic in many different ways on this channel, but I can't put too fine a point on it. And I think it gives you a connection to yourself that can really be a very useful tool for you for discernment. Listen, I see the TikToks and the Instagram posts and the other videos and the news articles. 5 top red flags, 10 flags you need to know, 6 flags to identify you're in a relationship with a narcissist, this list, that list. Listen, for most of us, if someone did these red flag things within the first few weeks of a relationship, many of us would run away. But red flags don't tend to work that way. They tend to be subtle. They tend to be a very light pink that slowly turns to red. They take a minute to unfold. They may be nonverbal, and they tend to be peppered in to what feels like a relationship that's nice in some ways. Red flags are specifically tend to refer to the beginning of a relationship or a turn in the road of a relationship. Exactly at a time when it's about love bombing and idealization and seduction and excitement and feeling good. So the red flags tend to get peppered in there with the good stuff, and they aren't the only prevailing state, which is why love bombing is so confusing, because there's maybe a few pinkish or reddish red flags popping up, and the good stuff pushes us to justify or rationalize, because especially in those early days, at a minimum, lots of people want the relationship to keep going. So what else can we do about staying on top of some of these earlier signs that a relationship may not be healthy? Why don't we try a little bit of somatic awareness? I don't even call this intuition, though you may experience it that way. But it's something that you might feel in your body, the proverbial hairs that stand up on the back of your neck. But it may not just be that. It may be a discomfort in your stomach, a tightness in your chest, a constriction of your throat, a discomfort that you just can't name and that you try to shake off. Just about any survivor of narcissistic abuse will think back to that time. Just do that for a minute right now. Think of one of the more impactful adult narcissistic relationships in your life. I mean, even a childhood one, if that's what works, but this tends to make a little bit more sense in adult relationships. Close your eyes. Think about as you started to feel more aware in this relationship that something wasn't right. How did you feel it physically? How did you talk to yourself about that feeling? Most of us don't give enough credence to these feelings. We may want to write them off to butterflies in our stomachs or fear or anxiety rather than, my body is telling me something isn't right here. I need to slow down. And of course, there might be all kinds of structural factors that are operating. You may feel pressured to make a relationship work, or you may like some things about this person, or you may feel an obligation to stick it out. So you may just push away these feelings or even pathologize them. Oh, I'm so paranoid. I need to stop this. But your body picks up that sense that someone's not really safe. Listen, those feelings, those bodily feelings, even came up for you in childhood if you had narcissistic parents, but it was a much higher stakes game then. That was a time when you didn't have the luxury of knowing what this bodily feeling meant. To view a parent as bringing up red flags, a kid doesn't know what red flags are. That's a whole tricky thing, right? For a child to feel there's something wrong with the parent feels disloyal. They may have a primal fear of losing the parent. They may fear punishment. But those detectors we carry in our body, they're even there for kids. I remember thinking, I'll tell you about a story about my childhood. I remember there's an adult in my neighborhood who made me very uncomfortable as a child. I physically felt that whenever I saw this person. And even when I'd walk home, I'd cross to the other side of the street when I went by that house. I didn't have a word for it. I just didn't feel safe. This person actually never harmed me. I also never went into situations where I saw the person was, even when other kids were going there. And when the situations would arise where this person would be, I would go home or ask to leave. And to my parents' credit, they never questioned why I would leave those situations. And they'd just say, okay, let's go home. I never shared the discomfort with anyone, but I felt it in my body. And that same bodily sensation, interestingly, is something that I felt when I encountered so-called red flags in adulthood as well. I wish I had been as clever as I'd been as a kid and done whatever the freaking equivalent was of stepping to the other side of the street then, too. How do we feel these sort of early signs and signals in our bodies? We have to pay attention to the sensations in us. Sometimes they parallel the very same feelings we might feel in an empty parking lot at night when we hear something, or in some other place when we feel at risk. It doesn't mean you have to get up and leave, though it could, but it does mean you slow down, perhaps cross to the other side of the street, as it were, and listen. Instead of trying to figure out if someone is looking at their phone too much on your third date, or talking about their ex-girlfriend too much, or interrupting you too much, instead of focusing on that, tune into yourself. It's not foolproof, and some of you may say, meh, I don't think I felt anything physically with my ex. But explore this a little. It may be a way of steering you away from this idea of sifting through these so-called red flags and instead tuning into yourself. So if you really try this, you might say, yeah, in some cases I did feel that physicality. Some of you might say, with a narcissistic ex, I didn't feel it in my body until things really started going south. But you did start feeling it then, and then still had to face the idea of what was hard for me to listen to in that. It might have been those practical factors that sort of sunk in. But I have to say that ahead of thinking about it, breaking it down, looking at checklists, if we really pay attention to that, this doesn't feel right. It comes up pretty quick. Sometimes it comes up right away. And it doesn't mean we get up and leave a conference room, but it could very well mean we distance ourselves, don't get into idle chit-chat, and end the conversation as soon as possible. We've talked about other topics related to cores, like core wounds. And that work on understanding some of the harder stuff and those revelations about things, like I said, about core wounds, can sometimes be more painful. It means unearthing painful patterns from childhood and from early in life. It also means being honest with yourself about the beliefs you hold for yourself and for the world. So let's talk about something that we may or may not always do the deep dive in with ourselves about. We may not even think about it as often because it doesn't even have as negative a connotation. But let's talk about our core values, not in business or anything, you as a human being. I think many people, if asked to share them, would be able to articulate some of their own core values. Some of you have probably had to do this maybe in some kind of workplace exercise. There are lots of websites out there that just list out lists and lists and lists of core values. You just type the term core values into a search engine and see what comes back at you. But some of the core values that come up most regularly are things like authenticity, beauty, compassion, kindness, success, fairness, community, family, loyalty, faith, responsibility, wealth. If I had to list the hundreds I have seen laid out, it would take forever. Sometimes they're even in like a deck of cards, and you can sort them into piles and do all kinds of other activities to help you organize your core values. Core values are a byproduct of lots of things. What we might have been taught in our families, by our schools, by our culture, by religious communities. And then as life goes on, we shape them in adulthood as we come into sort of our own sense of our values. Core values can also shift over time. Perhaps a high focus on success and wealth you might have had in younger age may shift to family and community later in life. While we tend to have central core values that persist, some core values can shift, again, with time and experience. Our core values are important because they guide how we work, how we relate, and what we expect or hope from the other people in our world. When our core values are disconnected from how we live and work and be in the world, it doesn't feel so good. And again, I'll be including a worksheet as we do throughout this series for you to actually explore your core values. That's available in the video notes. Now, in a narcissistic relationship, it can be very easy to drift away from your core values. Let's start with coming from a narcissistic family of origin. It's quite remarkable how much children can have some pretty attuned sense of their own core values, but then these core values may get distorted or shaped by a controlling family system that really may keep trying to intrude into a child's head that only suckers are nice, or compassion, or success and achievement are everything. Don't waste your time being such a little sweetie. In a family that doesn't see or validate or empathize with a child, the child may not be able to authentically or in a healthy manner develop core values. I have worked with many survivors of narcissistic family systems who will say that their family of origin really gave them a rather distorted sense of values, and it took them a long time in adulthood to almost deprogram from that and find their own path of values. Core values can also be shaped by a narcissistic relationship in adulthood. Whether we are aware of it or not, our core values do impact relational choices. If family, for example, is a core value, then you may gravitate to someone who says they value family. If faith is a core value, then you may choose a partner who shares that value. But the fact is, core values do not always actually clearly decide decision-making about a partner. The struggle is in narcissistic relationships. Your core values will be tested or skewed in those relationships. So many people don't understand these relationships, so they get stuck in trying to please an unpleasable partner. And in so doing, and trying to please that unpleasable partner, may actually start giving up on some of their core values to do so. A person, for example, who values friendship may become isolated and no longer nurture their friendships anymore. A person who has core values around achievement may end up thwarting their own career due to their partner's criticism and limiting comments, and will then believe that they personally, their core value has shifted away from achievement and career, rather than saying, oh my gosh, I'm giving up on the things that matter to me. The shape-shifting of the narcissistic relationship means that core values would shift too. And people who are mired in narcissistic relationships may not even want to do core values-oriented work because it will force a reckoning on what they have shifted from a core values perspective just to keep this relationship alive. Part of the healing process after a narcissistic relationship is really to simply get reacquainted with your core values. It can be painful to witness how far you may have drifted away from your original core values, and on top of that, to see how much the voices of your family or other significant narcissistic players in your life may have shaped you. So while it can be reorienting to do this work, it can also be colored by grief, because you may recognize that there was drift in the midst of these toxic and trying relationships. You may be wondering, Do narcissists have core values? I think they do. I think we all do. Because a core value isn't necessarily a good thing. Value seems like a good word, right? They may not be nice. And maybe we shouldn't be judging each other's values, right? But for a narcissistic person, their core values may be much more centered around things like wealth or status, power, achievement, success, beauty, youth. I mean, having a superficial core value is still a core value. It may not be in line with yours, but it's theirs. The real struggle comes because narcissistic people are so often not good at being self-reflective, so they're not able to articulate them and may even shape them to what they think the world wants. We can get a glimpse into anyone's core values by really looking at what motivates them and what orients them. For a person whose core values are family, friendship, and relationships, they will put the effort, the time, and the bandwidth and the heart into that, choosing that over other things. The real mind F word comes when the narcissist complains that their core values are compassion and wellness and integrity. And then they turn around and lie and abuse and manipulate. And it seems quite clear that what orients them is in fact wealth and power and status. But the narcissists aren't dumb. They know that's not always a good look. I actually once chatted with a narcissistic man who copped to it. It was just refreshing. He said point blank, I have 3 core values, and they're money, money, and money. And I'll do whatever, and the value of doing whatever it takes to get it. It wasn't my groove, but I certainly appreciated his clarity and ended the conversation as soon as possible. So when you meet a communal narcissist who's yammering on about their core values around humanitarianism, but at the same time you know they abuse their volunteers or sexually harass employees or engage in shady business practices, that disconnect is what plays with the mind of other people near the narcissist. The narcissistic person's incapacity to articulate and clearly see their core values is a core problem. Now, we have attached a worksheet in the video notes to explore this further for you to think about your core values, where they came from, how they motivate you, and also how have they, if they have, drifted as a result of a narcissistic relationship in adulthood, and the feelings you may have about this drift in your core values that have come about because of these narcissistic relationships. Understanding and staying in touch with our core values are a key element of learning about how these kinds of difficult systems have shaped us. Getting in touch with what matters to us and staying in touch with ourselves so we can make better choices in adult relationships, whether around intimate relationships, workplace relationships, friendships, or even our evolving relationships within our families of origin. And we need to recognize that when we are being pulled astray from our core values, that's about as big a red flag as there can be. So for all of us, we have to catch ourselves and make sure that our core values are shaped to us, not to others. Narcissistic people are very, very vulnerable to goal setting, every setting, to other people, right? Because they need supply. This is why communal narcissism is a thing. They know that they can get validation if they play at being a humanitarian and a rescuer and a saver of the world. So they put all that out there to get their validation, but their behavior doesn't line up with their core values. What any healthy person has is congruity. Congruity between their behavior and their values. When there's a disconnect there, that's really when the problems begin. Today we're going to talk a little bit about why a lot of survivors of narcissistic abuse can sometimes find it a little bit more comforting to be alone. So there's a funny paradox that people hearing from narcissistic relationships may experience. I think many of you know this, there's a loneliness, which makes sense. These relationships, even when you were still in them, and especially if you are still in them, these relationships and these experiences are very lonely places. And people aren't often able to get support or talk with people who understand what's happening to them, which makes you feel even more lonely and the sense of isolation. If you do actually manage to leave a narcissistic relationship, you may find that it is also difficult because you have a new sort of awareness in the world. You become more aware of patterns around you that are a little bit more narcissistic-y, that are invalidating and have gaslighting vibes and all of that. If you really heal, then the themes you might not have even noticed before start becoming really clear to you. And so your own social circle may not only shrink, it may be less likely that you let a lot of new people in, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, this relates to the concept of discernment, which I've talked about, and it's essential to healing from narcissistic abuse. Because it's so likely we'll repeat these narcissistic relationship cycles, it's so important to learn to steer clear of these dynamics by identifying them and allowing yourself to step back a little before you throw yourself in and try to make it all right, right? Now, what I have observed in survivors is that, especially if one of these relationships end, they do spend a lot of time alone when they leave these relationships. And in that time alone, paradoxically, actually do feel much better and stronger. And then the day will come when they do start spending time with more people, maybe at a larger social gathering. Maybe they meet some new people. And a lot of folks will say, you know what, I'm actually finding it a little bit unsettling to be with other people. The insensitive comments, the gaslighty stuff, and the fact that you've been through something that most people don't get can mean that you feel like you're doing better, healing, getting stronger, growing past this damned relationship. And then boom, after time alone where you're healing and not being gaslighted every day, now you find yourself in a mixed group of people, and it can feel like a setback. It's not a setback, but it highlights how tenuous this process of healing is and how important discernment can be. Now, what gets interesting is a phenomenon where many survivors, even if they're extroverted, may actually find that they feel most at peace when they're alone. It's when they feel like they can finally relax, be themselves, not be as vigilant, feel that they're not being judged. And obviously that's going to make sense, especially if all of that was happening in a relationship. Now, for survivors of narcissistic relationships in certain people were a source of stress and frustration, disappointment, manipulation, criticism, judgment. None of that's good. And when you heal, that same vigilance may persist. So first of all, we do know that solitude is great for healing. Those times where your nervous system can kind of take a rest, of not having to be on edge, of just exhaling and being you, it's essential. Think of it as just sort of putting a sprained ankle up so it'll heal. It can be complicated because some survivors will say, but I also feel lonely. After all this time in invalidating relationships, I would like to spend time with other people, which is also healthy. Now, so then you do. And again, what happens for many survivors is that time with other people can actually feel more demanding and unsettling. You may be more on edge, more self-monitoring, watching what you say, or being worried about saying or doing the wrong thing or right thing, or feeling hurt by offhanded comments that others who do not understand what you've been through may make. And it may not even be because of you, it's just because they're jerks, right? Let me give you a couple of examples. This may be for if you're a person who's divorced, or you've left a long-term committed relationship, and you're in the midst of people who are being a little bit sneery and contemptuous, or even making jokes about, oh, we never invite the divorced people to our dinner parties, or talk about like, oh, I certainly wouldn't want to be dating at my age. It doesn't feel good. Or a person, let's say you're someone who hasn't seen some old friends in a while, not since you've gotten out of this relationships, and finds that their lives are quite different than yours. They're very sort of steady and healthy marriages, might even be a reminder of what you don't have in your life. They may not get what you've been through. Or it might be a situation in which a person may have distanced once and for all from a particularly noxious family system and is in the middle of a group who is talking negatively about someone who's not close to their family, saying, ooh, did you hear she's not really talking to her mother? And they may not know that you're a person who's having that experience of having to distance from a family. These experiences can be exhausting, and there's lots more. I'm sure all of you could think of a few that you've been through. To have gone through narcissistic abuse and then come through the other side is a very isolating experience. something that most people do not get. They think it's just the usual family stuff. Families are tough, families are complicated, or relationships are hard. But you know, after what you've been through, and I certainly know it, it's a lot more than that. And this is why those times alone are not only so important to survivors, it's probably why you find them easier or might even crave them. The most important work of healing is individuation, coming into your own, finally sort of giving yourself permission to fully be yourself. It's that idea of authenticity. That's it. No longer feeling that you have to clip your wings or your soul in order for your relationship to work. As you lean and heal into that more authentic state, you're then better able to discern and stop living your life in that imbalanced state of chronic self-blame and self-doubt. But to do this, you're going to need long stretches of time where you just get to be you. And that is often best achieved by spending some time alone. For a long while, as you heal, other people are going to be a little bit tricky, especially new people, because a lot of folks don't get it. The dismissive comments, the not accounting for the idea that people could be this manipulative and this invalidating, or just the BS things people say just because, I don't know, they're jerks. It can mean that you need to pace yourself. Those times alone, yes, I get that they could feel lonely. But if you could perhaps reframe them as times that you're fortifying, building out your identity in yourself, times when you aren't devoting all of your psychological resources to ensuring that you are monitoring yourself in the room and making sure you're, again, this is not walking on eggshells. Instead, you can put the effort and the time into just coming into yourself. Listen, it's well established. I'm an introvert, so I think solitude is the best state ever. So for those of you who are more naturally extroverted, the solitude can sometimes feel like one more challenging process in healing. But if you're blessed to have the kinds of friends or social connections that do not always put you on your back foot, that you feel like you can truly, fully be yourself with, then great. Maybe not truly solo solitude, but limiting yourself quite a bit, at least initially, to interactions within this safe small group. In the early phases of healing, being particular about the company you keep is crucial. And the solitude becomes a reminder that you are actually great company. And all of that got lost in those years of invalidation. You stopped knowing who you were. And on top of that, having that kind of psychological nervous system rest for a minute can fortify you for those times when you are in groups and having to listen to inane people say inane and insensitive things. However, also remember that after being through a narcissistic relationship, you have some new strategies in your back pocket, including just disengaging and stepping away. You no longer need, ideally, hopefully never again, to be an audience to other people's invalidating BS. Whenever you can get out of it, do so. I hope that's helpful. And remember, being alone is a really important part of healing. And a lot of people say, oh, I am spending a lot of time. As soon as I started spending time with other people, it was a bit jarring. Listen to that. It's a very common experience. Thanks again.